To love is to worship. In a recent TV ad, I saw a young man torn between whether or not to go ahead with an arranged marriage. In his country, arranged marriages were the norm. However, after living in America, he was hesitant to adhere to this ancient custom, especially since he had never met his future wife. Even so, when she flew to the airport, he waited for her obediently, with flowers in hand and a gloomy expression on his face. But when he saw her enter, everything changed. It turns out that she was gorgeous. Suddenly, his gloomy expression disappeared. The thought of marrying this woman was no longer a feared duty, but a delight. What had changed? He had seen her. Dear friends, we often serve and worship God out of obligation. We crawl into church, force ourselves to serve others, but our hearts are not in it. We're like that young man at the airport, grudgingly holding flowers for God. We try to live holy, but we know we must, but it's heavy for us. We do not do it with joy. How can this change? See God. When we have a vision of who God really is, we suddenly feel energized to fulfill His mission. When we contemplate His greatness and His glory, worship ceases to be arduous. Once we understand His great love, serving and worshiping is not a duty, it is a joy. In speaking of love as an action, we cannot overlook the subject of worship, since to love God is to worship Him. Now, there may not be a topic that brings more controversies and conflicting opinions than the subject of worship, because many times, whenever the subject of worship is discussed, people go to the topic of music. Let me tell you that in our sermon today, we will not go into the endless discussions that revolve around the subject of worship. Rather, we will look at some biblical passages that show what true worship produces in the lives of believers. We will focus on three biblical recordings in the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew 2, verses 11 and 12, when the men went into the house and saw the child with Mary, his mother, they knelt down and worshiped him. They took out their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh and gave them to him. Later they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, and they went back home another road. The kings of the east, who were astronomers and scholars of prophecy, came from distant lands with the intention of worshiping the king who had been born. Can you imagine the time these men spent on their journey who met Jesus and worship him? They were willing to endure the difficult road and inclemency of the weather just to worship the Lord. And when they found him, they fell before him and offered him their costly gifts. What happened to them then? The story goes that after worshiping the Lord, they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, and they went home by another road. Friends, without wishing to try to add anything extra to the Bible passage, we can say that everyone who truly worships the Lord will return home by another way. In other words, a change of direction and purpose will occur in your spiritual life and experience. A second passage that speaks of the effect of true worship can be seen in Matthew chapter 14, 32 and 33. When Jesus and Peter got into the boat, the wind died down. The men in the boat worshiped Jesus and said, "You really are the Son of God." The story goes that a great storm threatened to sink the disciples' boat. In the midst of the storm, Jesus came to them walking on water. When they saw him, the frightened disciples cried out, thinking he was a ghost. But Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take charge, I am, fear not." Found in Matthew 14, verse 27. It is then that Jesus enters the boat, and miraculously the storm stops and the raging sea calms. Observing the Lord's power, the disciples fell at his feet and worshiped him, for they had seen the Lord's power over the storm. They had experienced the peace that surpasses all understanding. Now they could do nothing but worship the Lord. Prostrate at his feet, there was no room for fear. The insecurity was gone. Yes, dear friends, when we witness God's power and worship him, the fear and insecurity that threatens to sink our lives disappear. The peace that surpasses all understanding fills our hearts, and with confidence we can say, if God is on our side, can anyone be against us? Romans 8, verse 31. The last verse I would like to share is from Matthew. Suddenly, Jesus met them and greeted them, then went near them, held on to his feet, and worshiped him. That's found in Matthew 28, verse 9. The Friday before this event, the Lord had been crucified, and the hopes of his followers had been dashed. Discouragement, defeat, and disillusionment had knocked on the door of each of them. Only some had remained at the foot of the cross. Most of them had run away and left the Master alone. With great sadness, some disciples, and especially some women, saw how the body of their beloved Master was taken to the tomb. After the Sabbath, these brave women decided to go to the place. But what was their surprise? The tomb was empty. Jesus had risen, and he himself went out to meet them and said to them, "Hail!" Seeing their resurrected Master, all these faithful believers could do was embrace the Lord's feet and worship him. There, prostrate at his feet, discouragement and disillusionment came to an end. In adoration of the risen Christ, his experience, which seemed like defeat, was changed into victory. What happened to these wise men from the east, the disciples, and the women who went to the tomb on the day they saw the person, power, and authority of Jesus? They worshiped him, and as a result, their lives were transformed. When you focus on God's person, power, and authority, you will love him, worship him, and as a result, your life will be transformed. Ralph Waldo Emerson famously said, "We become what we worship." In other words, our subject of worship shapes our identity. The evolutionary scientist Charles Darwin is said to have once written in his autobiography, "My main amusement and my only job throughout this life has been scientific work. From this work," he added, "I am never idle, since it is the only thing that makes my life bearable." What effect did dedication to scientific work have on the person Darwin became? Until the age of 30, Darwin continued to write poetry. It gave me great pleasure, and I delighted intensely with Shakespeare. But now, for many years, I find it so intolerable, boring, that it makes me nauseous. My mind seems to have become a kind of machine for grinding general laws from large collections of facts. My mind seems to have become a kind of machine for grinding general laws from large collections of facts. This loss is a loss of happiness. I became a withered leaf for all subjects except science, which he saw as a great evil. Now consider the life of another influential genius theologian, Jonathan Edwards. At the age of 19, Edwards wrote, "Resolved to cast my soul upon the Lord Jesus Christ, to trust in him, and to consecrate myself entirely to him." Later in life, Edwards reflected on how his object of worship affected his soul over the years. He brought to the soul an inexpressible purity, brightness, peace, and ecstasy. In other words, it turned the soul into a field or a garden. Two gifted men, one became a withered leaf and the other a garden. The object of their worship shaped the very different kind of men they became.